Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. And today we are going to be looking at the Shilos and Shuvos of the Beis Dovid. Now, what is the Beis Dovid, you may ask? Well, I asked the same question. And our esteemed guest who is joining us today, Rav Yitzy Tanner, is going to tell us about him. Now, Yitzi is currently studying for smicha at the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, aka Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzhak Elchanan, and is currently serving as rabbinic intern at Shari Tefillah in Teaneck, New Jersey. Previously, he received his MS in physics, as well as a BA with a double major in physics and biophysics at the University of Pennsylvania, following his 3 years of study at Yeshivat Har Etzion. And as I like to say, you studied physics, you studied biophysics, and I guess now in Smicha, you're studying metaphysics. Am I right?
That's right, exactly. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, likewise. So I was very intrigued when we connected and you told me about this Chuvas Beis Dovid. Now, I'm just an Am Haaretz, so it's possible that's why I am not familiar with it. But just to give our listeners a little bit of a heads up, some episodes, it's more about the inner workings of the tshuva. Some of it is more about learning about the man behind the tshuva. We will certainly do both. But I think a great place to start off is maybe tell us about the Beis Dovid. Who's the author? What's behind this work? What's the context? What's the shaila? And why were you particularly interested in it?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so just to start, I obviously you're not an Amaretz, and I think not too many people know about the Beis Dovid, even though 100 years ago many people knew about him. So maybe I'll start with how I found out who the Beis Dovid is. So on my father's side, it's known that we're related to the Leiter family. All the Leiters are related. Rabbi Dr. Yechiel Leiter is the ambassador now. There's some other Leiters in Scranton. And so we knew that we were related to the Leiter family. And one day when I was in Drush in Yeshiva, I saw they had a book sale and they had an old copy of the Beis Dovid that was printed in Vienna in like the 1930s. And so I bought it and read through it. And then I became very familiar with the Beis Dovid. I fell in love with it. I fell in love with Chuvot in general through that. And the Beis Dovid, he's not very well known today, but in his time he was very well known. He was born in 1892 in Zavalov, and he had the beginning of his career in Europe, and then he moved to America. He moved to Pittsburgh in 1920, and he spent the rest of his career in Pittsburgh until 1974. And he was incredibly prolific. Starting from a very young age, everyone knew he was an Eloi. In his tshuva, in his Beis Dovid, he has shilas here from when he's 12, 13, 14, already asking,
Wow.
already answering shilas. He had correspondences with all the Gedolei Dor would ask him questions. He has questions in here from Sonnenfeld or C. Pesach Frank. He was
It's interesting, right? Not just from Gedolim, even in the United States where he resided, but from Eretz Yisrael, which that's fascinating that they were sending their shilas over to sea. And you forgive me again to a rabbi, at least to me, who's a little bit obscure, but maybe we should know more about him.
Yeah, I think it's a good question why people don't know about him, but he had a lot of letters with all the Gedolim back in Europe, and they would write in their letters, in glowing terms to him about his incredible Bekias and how much they appreciated him. I should mention that a lot of the history here, for anyone who's more interested in going more depth, so he has another book of Tshuvot, the Tzion L'Nefesh Chaya. It's named after his grandmother Chaya, like the other Tzion L'Nefesh Chaya. It's also named after Chaya.
Slach, right?
Yeah, the Tzlach. And what happened was his father wrote a couple of Tshuvos. His father wrote, I think maybe 29 Tshuvos, and he sent it to his son, Rav Zev Wolf, and asked him to publish a sefer. So Rav Zev Wolf said, like, okay, while I'm publishing my father's Tshuvos, I'm going to publish a couple of my own, and then he published like over 100 of his own. And they
Very, very, very casual. Slips in 100 chuvos.
Yeah, exactly. And they reprinted it, Mossad Rav Kook, a couple of years ago, and they put like a hefty, like 40-page biography of him in the beginning there. So anyone who's
Oh, that's incredible. You must have been poring over that biography.
Yeah, I was looking over it. It's great. There's a lot of it's very well documented. One thing that I'll say about it is They say all these crazy misas about, when he was 12 years old, he wrote his first sefer on Gittin, but then they show you the sefer and they show that he actually did it.
Oh
So
my gosh.
yeah, yeah. So it's
That's
a very,
that's remarkable. I mean, do we know who he learned under? That,
yeah, yeah. So his primary Rebbe was I wrote it down here, Rav Meir Arik, who also wrote a lot of Chuvot, and he also learned under Rav Yosef Engel in like during World War One. He spent some time in Vienna. There was a lot of different Gedolim who went to Vienna during the war to take refuge there, and he got to become friendly with a lot of them. But his primary influence, besides for his family, obviously, his father was also a big Rav, his grandfather was a big Rav, but he really was a Talmud of Rav Meir Arik.
so how did he wind up in Pittsburgh? And this might just be my ignorance in general. I guess I'm wondering how Jews in general wound up in Pittsburgh. We were talking about this. I'm gonna be in Pennsylvania soon, God willing. But Allentown is only like an hour and a half from Teaneck, an hour from Philadelphia. So my friend Rabbi Zweiter, who was on the podcast, he moved there, and he's like, "Oh, you're so close to us now." And I look on Google Maps, I'm like, I'm way closer to New York than to Pittsburgh. So how did people wind up all the way over there, and what brought him over there?
Yeah, that's a good question. They didn't say in the biography exactly how he ended up in Pittsburgh. One aspect that I think there are some parts of his personality and personhood that made him a good fit for Pittsburgh. So, for example, the reform movement in Pittsburgh was very, very strong in the early 1900s. That was like, in a way, the height of early reform Judaism in America. A lot of it was in Pittsburgh. And Rav Leiter was incredibly worldly, incredibly knowledgeable. I should mention when he was back in Europe, he wrote a German PhD thesis. I'm going to butcher the title, but it was called like Stellung der Frau in Talmud, the position of women in the Gemara. And he wrote a whole PhD thesis on like what does the Gemara think about women? And in
Interesting. What kind of position does he strike? What's his
yeah,
does
so
he go with the general like, equal but different roles approach?
so I don't speak German, so I
Oh,
tried
fair enough, fair enough.
reading
Neither do I.
a little bit and reading some secondary literature on it. He does have another tshuva in Beis Dovid, Sadi Tess. He has a whole tshuva where someone asked him, like, someone who apparently was a maskil says to him, like, how come women don't learn? Like, how come from women don't learn? In 1912, they asked him this. He was like 20 years old. And he has a whole tshuva where he goes through and he says, yeah, it's a huge problem. And throughout all of Jewish history, Jewish women were always learned and they always knew halacha, and we have to improve our education for women and we have to make sure that they're learning more. So definitely there's a
So just
certain
remind me, was he originally, you said he was from Europe? Was he from Western Europe?
he was from Zavalov, which is probably in like
That's
Ukraine.
Yeah, it sounds Eastern. So that's actually fascinating because that's something, Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, those who are part of like the Hildesheimer seminary. I feel like you get that more from Western Europe, from Germany. So coming from Eastern Europe and having that kind of perspective is all the more unique, I would say.
Yeah, he definitely was very worldly in that way in terms of his approach to women and his approach. He had a rich correspondence with a bunch of like professors at JTS. He was friends with all the reform rabbis in Pittsburgh. Um, so he
Wow. So
definitely,
he was really, the consummate out-of-town Orthodox rabbi. He
yeah,
had the real like bona fides and scholarship, and he was able to kind of build bridges and be friends with everybody and make things happen, it sounds like.
yeah. There's an incredible letter that was written by the reform rabbi in Pittsburgh because Rav Meir Shapiro, he was very close with, was coming to collect money for Chachmei Lublin. And the reform
Mhm.
rabbi says, oh, my good friend Rav Zev Wolf Leiter is bringing in an honored rabbi, Dr. Meir Shapiro. And Dr. Meir Shapiro is going to be collecting money for his yeshiva. And like, it's a very worthy cause. And everyone in our
Wow.
reform shul in Pittsburgh in the 1920s should donate to Chachmei Lublin.
That's remarkable. I could never see something like that happening today. I mean, wow, a world that was. I mean, back in the day, as it's well known, I mean, generations before us, when Rabbanim went to JTS, we know that JTS Rabbanim were much closer to YU than they are today, based on their education, their pedigree. So, but the reform movement also, I think to me, that's a little bit more of a surprise.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think he ever, compromised his values or anything, or ever, was agreeing. But I think he was someone who was like widely respected. Everyone knew he was an Eloi. Everyone respected his Torah knowledge and his sincerity, and I think that went a long way for him.
100%. I think that's a model that modern Orthodox rabbis try to strike. I mean, I hope we don't compromise on our halachic integrity and Torah values. At the same time, the masses should be able to see that a rabbi is someone who's sophisticated and is well read, and that they could appreciate that. So that's certainly something that sounds like he was able to personify, thank God.
Yeah, yeah. And one other aspect of the biography in the introduction to Tzion Nefesh Chaya is they also talk about his involvement in communal needs. Obviously, as an out-of-town rabbi in Pittsburgh, so he set up the first kosher kitchen in the hospital. I think it seems like it was the first kosher kitchen in a hospital in America. He
Oh,
had
wow.
a tshuva
He
about
beat
like,
Sauer to it.
what was that? He beat Satmar, yeah. He has a tshuva about sending a Sefer Torah to jail, for one of the inmates. And he was involved in education back in Europe. So he was very involved. He had his, Rosh Hashanah Shamayim, but his feet were firmly planted on the ground.
Well said, well said. And so, speaking of his chuvos, as you mentioned, there's a wide array of fascinating chuvos, but we're looking at Siman Ayin Aleph today. And maybe you want to just tell us what's the shaila that he's dealing with here.
Yeah, so the shaila that he's dealing with, and he dealt with it in one previous tshuva in Siman Lamed Ches, is about whether a Kohen can voluntarily enlist in the army, obviously a non-Jewish, European army. And in terms of context, we're probably talking World War One. So can a Kohen join the army? And then later in the tshuva, he talks about, and if a Kohen does join the army and he kills someone, is he allowed to do Nisiyat Kapayim? Can he do Birkas Kohanim still? Can
So
he
this
still?
is an interesting question. I know, again, I'm not a historian, but I've read up a little bit on Rav Moshe Feinstein's biography, and I know that, a huge part of his younger life was trying to get out of being drafted into the Russian army. And it's a whole story about bribing this official, getting a bracha from the Chafetz Chaim, and this and that. And it sounded like people were avoiding getting drafted into the military. So I guess, there are different kinds of wars. Some are more defensive wars. Some are more, the Tsar just wants to expand his borders, or the communist regime wants to expand their borders. So what's right? So the context here you think is World War One we're looking at?
Yeah, I think so. And as we'll see in the continuation, he talks about different armies with Jews on both sides. So it's probably World War One.
Right, right. And what's interesting is he's asking about a Kohen going to the army. I guess the obvious issue is Tumas Mace coming in touch with a dead body. But in more interesting question, which I think you just alluded to, is what about any Jew joining the army? Is there an imperative? Is it just mutter, or might there even be an isser potentially?
Yeah, and certainly if you think about, his earlier years were shaped in, he was born in 1892, so he's, in his 20s while World War One is going on. He's very young and he's seeing a lot at such a young age. So certainly you can
This
imagine.
is real halacha lemaisa for him. This isn't a theoretical. And to make the distinction, which you mentioned, the difference here is that they're fighting in a foreign land. One may be tempted to distinguish this from what's going on. I'm not going to wade too much into that whole entire minefield. That was a terrible pun of what's going on in Israel. But he opens up by saying, "Davar zem kohanim hochel melchama bisman sheYisrael shruin al admasan." So he opens up with a question about what about when Jews are settled in their land? There's already a question about a Kohen serving in the military, even when we are actually in Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, certainly that Shiloh is still relevant today. And I think also an unresolved Shiloh that seems like it's a machloket haposkim today is the question of a Kohen who killed someone in war. My impression is that that's kind of unresolved, and different poskim you go to today might say different things.
Right. If I remember correctly, one of the precedents for this is that David Hamelech couldn't build the Beis Hamikdash, and it seems to be, I think it's Divrei Yamim suggested because he spilled blood. So the question is it just like a strict liability that if you murdered someone, even if it was ba'ones or accidental, or you had to, those hands can't serve to build the Beis Hamikdash into Duchen, or maybe it's because he was overly cruel in how he went about his military campaign. So that's the Machlokes there, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So should we get into it?
Absolutely. Okay, so this is the part where I will attempt to be quiet for a few minutes, and you give us the breakdown of the tshuva.
Okay, so just one thing I want to flag in the even in the Shiloh already. So first of all, there's no year on the tshuva. I should mention a lot of his tshuva don't even have the name of the person who's asking. I think sometimes that's sometimes we lost it. Sometimes it might be a humility thing, although it's hard to imagine like how he's being humble if he has Shilohs with from Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank and Rav Meir Shapiro and everyone. But this is to a fellow named Rav Meshulam Yisachar Levi Horovitz. In the biography, they say that this guy's father and Rav Zev Wolf were contemporaries, they were friends. And it's
Mhm.
interesting, he brings a historical precedent from Sefer Chashmonaim that we know the Maccabeim were Kohanim and they went to war. So first of all, that's interesting as a source. We know that's not a classic halachic source that we use. Um, yeah, so Rav Zev Wolf Leiter, he gets into the Shaila, and one thing that stands out in all of his Shilas is his incredible Bechias. There's stories in the biography that you wouldn't believe. He has one of his craziest chuvas that he has. It's I think it's Kufyud Test. He was asked about, someone asked him like, tell me the name of every woman mentioned in rabbinic literature. And he says his answer is, oh, I don't really have my Svarim on me right now, so let me just make a list of the ones that I remember. And then he just lists 60 women, like who are mentioned all over.
Well,
Maybe we could get
if I
like,
may, that was an expertise of him, it sounds like, from his
right,
doctorate that you
right.
mentioned.
Yeah, he was expert at that. Another Shuva, he's like, let me tell you all the times the Rambam says Yir Ali. Like he lived in a pre-Google era, so a lot of the Shilas are things that you and I might Google today, but he was the Google because he knew everything. So I think that really shines through in the Shilah because in this question of whether Kohanim go to war, so he cites, 6 different Gemaras that imply various ways. There's a Mordechai, there's the Gemara about Yifas Toar. And he seems to cite some precedent for it throughout the various Gemaras.
I
That's
found interesting, he cites another Beis Dovid, a Beis Dovid al Mishnayos.
yeah, some other Beis Dovid. Uh, and oh, here's a nice point that he makes. So there's a question in the Divrei Saschar, and he shows, oh, that question was already asked in the by Rabbeinu Balei Atosos Beriva al Torah. And
Hmm.
this is something he does all the time, that he loves showing like, oh, this thing that you think it's a machlokas achronim, like actually the Rishonim talk about that. Actually, the Gaonim talk about it. He was very into shuas of Gaonim, and he wrote a whole book called Mitoratan Shel Rishonim, and he was very involved in showing that a lot of these shilas they were already dealt with many years ago, and people just didn't always know where to look.
Right, and I think that point from the Bali Tosis from the Riva over there that you mentioned is important for the analysis because he says, "Daha Pinchas hayimavu haya Mashiach milchama." Pinchas became a Kohen, and we see that he was serving in the military. So maybe that's a precedent. But I guess the big question is Pinchas the rule, or is he the exception that proves the rule?
Yeah. Yeah, he brings proofs from Pinchas. He brings another interesting proof he has is someone who's engaged to a wife and hasn't married her yet, so he returns from war. So the Gemara says an exception is a Kohen who's engaged to a Grusha and Chalutza, which implies that normally a Kohen would go out to war. And so he brings a lot of different Gemaras that go both ways.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and then he starts talking about Tumas Mace. And talking about whether non-Jews transmit tumas mace to the Kohen. And I'm going to skip here to get to the like money line. He has this point you mentioned you find it interesting. So again, this is World War I. You have a lot of Jews on Jews combat. Countless stories about that. And he says, I'll read like a half a sentence. He says, if the Jews go out to war, they're for sure gonna fight against other Jews. And right, there's no country whose army doesn't contain Jews, and that you're gonna end up killing other Jews basically for no reason. And then he quotes the Sefer Yosef Ben Gurion, which I think is
Mhm.
Sipun, that talks about how back in, I'm also gonna botch this, it's a Greek word, Statopolis, or I looked it
I
up.
can't pronounce it either for what it's worth.
I think it's Beit Sha'an in modern Hebrew. And he says, and he brings this as a source, another, he brought from a wider canon than many people. So he says that in that town, they used to have the Jews fight against each other, which is against our das, it's against our religion, it's against our laws. And it sounds like even Jews, a regular Jew, Israel, should not optimally join an army.
So these are great methodological points that you're making that, part of where we could see his, one might think that this is just a standard halachic tshuva and it's no different than had any other rabbi written it. But we could see that his reference to apocryphal works and incorporating them into the mainstream halachic process is something to be noted, right? Quoting Sefer Chashmonaim, quoting Yosifun. I mean, he's certainly not the first. Like these do get cited by other people, but I don't know Rav Sonnenfeld's tshuva so well, but I would imagine if you read something from the Ira Charedas, like they may not be making that same reference per se.
Yeah, certainly he was, he wasn't inhibited. He wanted to find the MS and he would look everywhere. He was involved in publishing Chuvos of Gaonim and Chuvos of the Rif and a lot of sources that,
And he does so casually, which is the best part. Sometimes when people they cite something that's a little bit off the beaten track, they'll want to make a whole to do about it. He's like, no, 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 these are just sources that are part of the Jewish canon that we need to consult. He just casually puts it in there. Had you not, thought twice about it, we wouldn't have even talked about it.
yeah, I think for sure you'll find some historians will say that when a Rav quotes like a rare manuscript or a weird source, it's almost like a power move to show his intellectual prowess and to assert dominance over others. But you don't get that sense at all with Rav Leiter. You find he's just, oh, here's, 30 sources about this question.
Right, right. It's like I remember I was looking at the Satmar Rebbe's tshuva against Rav Moshe on I think it was either on artificial insemination or maybe it was the Mechitza one. Those were both the big ones. So
Yeah.
he said I'm going to write a tshuva. Like what happens is there's this crazy psag that came out. I wasn't going to say anything about it, but someone needs to make a protest, so I'm going to write a tshuva biksara. And then it just like goes on page after page. I've double column pages, and I'm like, yeah, I think that was a bit of a power move. Like this is how I write Bekitzer. Don't ask me to, this isn't my final form, if you
Yeah.
understand the reference.
Yes.
So, okay, very good. So back to the tshuva, right? You just mentioned that important line that Rachmana litzlan, you'll have Jew pitted against Jew from one nation against the other nation. And Rachmana litzlan, I mean, already death is a bad thing, but certainly a fellow Jew killing another fellow Jew, that might bring this not just to the level of not being obligated, being putter from joining the army, but maybe there might even be a potential isser laden within it.
Yeah. I mean, throughout the Tshuva, he doesn't seem to, you don't find nationalistic concerns at all of maybe a person has an obligation to join
Right.
the army. The whole question is it mutter to join the army? Never
Right.
you discuss whether, it's a value for a Jew to join the army.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's not unique. Yeah, I wonder if that's just the gullus mentality of Jews that we flee from one country to the next without any particular fealty to that country. So, I mean, even on the next page, he cites some sources, Tosin of Zara, and he talks about that joining. He says, "Ve'inkan savik shemisha osakain meritzono belishum ones ukfia." Anyone who willingly enlists in the army. So then what are you doing? He says that it actually it could constitute k'ma'avid atzmo ledas. It's like one is forfeiting their life. It's like suicide. That's what he likens it to. That you're just forfeiting your life for no good cause. It doesn't take the patriotism or civic duty into account.
Yeah, yeah. And in the continuation of that paragraph, he kind of you might ask, okay, I'm not supposed to join the army, so what do I do? So this is also a fascinating line he has. I've saw a couple of contemporary writers, like in Rav Brody's book on ethics of our fighters. I saw that he quotes this line. He says, "V'achiyuv al kol Haredi." Haredi, obviously, without the social,
Right.
the not with the
God-fearing
connotation of
Jew.
today. Every God-fearing Jew, la'avod be'ad hashalom ha'olami. Every Jew has to work. Sounds like it was written by Gandhi, but every Jew has to work for world peace. Every God-fearing Jew should work to have world peace, so no innocent blood is spilled, and we will end all wars. Like
It's
just
interesting. I mean, I wonder how much he's actually advocating for us to go to anti-war demonstrations versus, like learn Torah and discuss that there'll be shalom. It's not clear. I think it's strategic ambiguity. I think he purposely leaves it a little bit vague.
yeah, that's a good question. Like if we, in his life's work, we don't find it doesn't seem like he was a big anti-war demonstrator. Certainly he worked on, unifying different groups and things of that nature, but I don't think he was much of a politician.
Right. Oh
Uh,
yeah, it doesn't. But I mean, not a politician in the bad sense, but in the good sense, he seemed to be good with communal politics. At least we could give him that. So,
yeah,
so as
certainly.
we're approaching the end, is there anything else? I know there's a little bit more to the tshuva, though I think we got through the juicy parts of it. Is there anything else in the tshuva you want us to know? Anything about Rabbi Leiter that you would like us to know about him?
Let's see. Yeah, I mean the rest of the tshuva is interesting, but it's more of the same. Here's a shiloh. Let me give you a million makaros to answer it. In the next paragraph, we know not worth going through inside, but he was asked about the Kohen doing Nisiat Kapayim, doing dochening, and he says, oh well, there's the Ravya and the Zohar and the or Zarua and the Tavnis Os Yosef in his Chidushim on Sanhedrin, and like I can't imagine that some guy missed this passage in the Zohar, and then like in one of the last paragraphs he quotes this Sefer of Yebe who quotes a Tosfos, and then I think this line's crazy. He says, "Vitama ani al kvod kedushaso ana matzazot be'ezeh makram v'tosos bulai toso v'yesham." Right, so he quotes a Tosos that he doesn't recognize. So he says, it's a mistake, right? So think about how well you have to know Tosos to when
Make that
it's a
claim.
Tosos, you say, it must be Tosos never said that, right? But I
Wow,
think
that's
that
that's a real
the
that's like a real flex right there. But I mean, but clearly he demonstrated his scholarship in erudition. I'm not qualified to say that, but from what I've read from him so far and his range of sources and knowledge that he has, I mean, if someone can make a claim like that, it sounds like he's the one qualified to do it.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of what's been amazing to me the more I look into him that you hear these Gedolim Isas about the Bakiyas that people have, and sometimes they're like, they seem unlikely, and I'm always a bit skeptical, and I'm always a bit hesitant to accept them. But when you read these Chuvot, it's like Baruch Hashemesh, like it's as clear as day. It's obvious that the level of Gaonis that he demonstrates. They say in the introduction that he memorized the entire Shut Shalom Meshiv by Rav Yosef Shalom Nathanson Baal Peh, and I
My
believe
God.
when I read the Chuvos, you see that he's just quoting him left and right, and he's he's almost. It's always funny the tone he takes when someone misses a source. He always says like, how did this person miss how did he not know this Riva ala Torah? How did he not know the
Inconceivable,
Zohar?
right? Like, how can you possibly miss it? He doesn't understand how that's possible.
Yeah, so I think just I find it inspiring, So this guy, he didn't live so long ago. He passed away in 1974, and he was really holding in, Kol Torah Kula in an incredible sense. Chuvos, he knew every sefer of Chuvos. He was, a communal man. He did a lot of communal work. His views on women, I think, were, not norm of the time. His relationship with other streams of Judaism were also very interesting for the day. And he just, it seems like he kind of just, maybe as you said earlier, he was an out-of-town rabbi. They get a little bit more leeway. They get to do their thing. And I think he just lived an incredible life. And I wish more people would become interested in his work
Mhm.
and try to learn about him as I have, because I think just
Yeah.
reading through his Chuvos is incredibly inspiring and eye-opening.
Well, I wish I could have brought him on the podcast, but certainly bringing you is really good. And I could expect, hopefully, as you're completing your smicha, I could assume that there'll be a PhD done on Rabbi Leiter as well. So I don't know if you thought of doing that, but I'm certainly rooting for that to happen. And thank you so much for teaching me about him, about your family yichus, and this amazing, there needs to be a documentary, The Rabbanim Who Built America, but focusing on all the rabbanim who don't get all that time in the limelight, but really deserve it. And this is just one other great example of it. So thanks for coming on the show and wishing you continued hatzlacha in your rabbanus.
Amen. Thank you so much. And also, haslacha to you, Allentown's great community.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
Okay, take care.